Quick content warning for this episode. We do dive into some deep topics surrounding substance use, substance abuse, and eating disorders. So, if this is something that you find would be potentially triggering to your recovery journey, go ahead and skip this episode, and we'll see you in the next one. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am so excited that you're listening in today because we just had a really great conversation with Amanda from Therapy for Women. Amanda is a licensed therapist and the creator of the popular Instagram account and TikTok at Therapy for Women. She is in recovery from an addiction and eating disorder. And in her clinical work, Amanda specializes in supporting clients in the overlap and intersection of both. She's the founder of Therapy for Women Center in Philadelphia and is serving clients across the country. So it was really awesome to talk to somebody who is so specialized in the area of substance use and eating disorders, because really this conversation comes up a lot in my own clients with my own coaching about how sometimes even just social drinking or smoking marijuana may relate to binge eating or a form of control when it comes to food or substances. So there's so many nuances to it, which we dive into with Amanda. So I'm really excited for you to listen into this conversation. And I hope that you gain some insight from it. And of course, make sure you check out Amanda at Therapy for Women on Instagram and of course TikTok. TikTok's how I found her. And I love her TikToks. They're just so funny and relatable, but shed light on some really important topics. So let's dive into this conversation and let me know your thoughts at the end. Welcome to Behind the Binge, the podcast where we bring forth much needed conversations about binge eating recovery and ditching diet culture. I'm your host, Marissa Kaimilik, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and binge eating coach. This is our space to dive into practical tips to heal from binge eating, challenge your diet culture beliefs, discuss the nuances of intuitive eating, and empower you to recover. Let's start exploring what's behind the binge. All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Marissa.
Of course. Well, it's been really great chatting with you so far. I actually found you through your TikToks, which was just
Mm.
so relatable and great. So I really love it. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Amanda White. I'm a licensed therapist. You might know me on Instagram or TikTok as Therapy for Women. And I have a therapy practice in Philadelphia. Um, and yeah, I talk a lot on my page about substance use and eating disorders, and that is my specialty in my clinical work. And I really got into that specialty because I'm in recovery from a substance use disorder and an eating disorder. And when I was trying to get into recovery and navigating all of that like 10 years ago, I found that there wasn't a lot of people who specialized in the overlap. And I felt frustrated because I had to go to one therapist for this and one therapist for that. And different recovery programs, and there were a lot of people that struggled with both, but it seemed like not many people were talking about both in the same place. So that's really kind of what piqued my interest in it.
Yeah, I love that. So were you becoming a therapist already when you were going through your own recovery, or did
I
that
was.
spark? Okay, very cool. And so then you just kind of found that need and decided to kind of specialize a little bit more specific.
Yeah. I struggled with an eating disorder and a substance use disorder throughout high school, throughout college. And I felt very lost after I graduated college, and I started seeing a therapist who was awesome. And she like disclosed that she was in recovery from a substance use disorder. And that really like gave me a lot of hope, because I was like, oh, if you're doing this, maybe I could do this. And I kind of promised myself that if I got into recovery and I made it to the other side, that I would do the same for other people.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's so interesting how she disclosed with you, her own recovery journey, because I found even becoming a dietitian, we're constantly told in our studies, don't self-disclose, like make it about the client. But I often find that there is a time and a place to self-disclose, and that can honestly bring that connection between you and your client or your patient to where they're like, wow, okay, you not only are doing it or have done it yourself, but you get me. And
Yeah.
that's what I found as well when working with people through my own eating disorder recovery as well,
Yeah.
is just when I knew that they came from that place that I was in, there was just that relatability and just
Yeah.
more of a deeper understanding. So I think that's really, really great that that kind of sparked something in you in your own journey, but also now with where you are helping other people with the same thing, I'm sure that impacts the other way around now with your current clients.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I literally wrote a paper in grad school in favor of self-disclosure and I got like a terrible grade on it
Oh,
because the
wow.
teacher didn't agree with it and didn't like it. But I think there's a time and a place, and I think especially when it's put into your marketing or on your website or something like that, then people can kind of, it isn't for everyone. Not everyone wants to see a therapist or a dietitian who, has the same experience as them or has that experience. But then at least they kind of like know. So to me, I really like being able to put it on my Instagram or my website, because then people, it's not like I don't have to like tell them necessarily in session. We don't spend time talking about my recovery, but if they are interested or they want to know, they can know that in the background before they go in.
Right, exactly. And I think that's important to note that there's a person for everybody, right? Like,
Yeah.
and some people want someone who has been there and some people don't. But I think it's really great to be open about that so that way
Yeah.
someone can make that decision. So you mentioned, in eating disorder recovery and your substance abuse disorder, you
Yeah.
were kind of trying to find recovery for both of those at the same time. So, how do you find that substance abuse disorders and eating disorders go hand in hand? Like, do you find that they often have blurred lines there about maybe why they're happening together?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of research and statistics actually just about how overlapped they are. Obviously, studies range because it depends on what you quantify as a substance use disorder, what you quantify as an eating disorder, but statistics range from like 15 to 45%. So there's a pretty big range, but I mean, 45% is a huge number. And personally, before I started my private practice, I ran a women's unit, a long-term women's unit in substance use disorder rehab. And I was shocked at how many women, I mean, I would say 99% of them all had some type of thing going on with their food. Whether they actually met criteria as having an eating disorder, no. But it's such a common, whether people realize once they stop using that actually part of how they started using drugs especially was potentially to reduce their appetite. I mean, that was a big
Mm.
thing that people discovered. Or people realize once they stop using that they have some issues with food, and then they end up either binging or they gain weight and then they don't want to gain weight, so then they end up restricting in some capacity. There is so much overlap, and one thing that's really really difficult, I think, and sad that I see in substance use, like addiction rehabs, is they often talk about sugar as being addictive and food as being addictive. And they do
Yeah.
a lot of things like, I mean, when I worked there, like sugar was limited from patients. They wouldn't let them like eat dessert. They would, if someone was caught, quote unquote, like with a bag of chips in their room or something like that, it was like, this is addict behavior. Like,
Oh,
you're an addict. This
no.
is you being an addict.
Wow.
And it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if you try to take food away from someone, you make them in food scarcity. And a lot of these people, I mean, if you think about someone who's coming off the streets who hasn't been getting adequate nourishment for years. I mean, most people aren't if they are using substances in a big way, whether they were like actually homeless and experiencing real food scarcity, or they just were so addicted that they weren't hungry and weren't nourishing themselves. It's a very common thing to, once you start, getting into recovery, that your hunger cues come back, your body wants to nourish itself, your body is looking for nutrients. So it was really sad to see them like pathologize that and cause shame for people. And I always think about how you first have to give people enough food before you can ever start to worry about, if they're eating enough nutrients or things like that. Like
Right.
the enoughness needs to come first.
Absolutely, because our bodies aren't going to crave carrots and broccoli and
Yeah.
celery when you haven't had enough energy to begin with. It's gonna crave those energy dense foods like the chips. And so to
Yep.
hear,
Yep.
that those were maybe shamed when that's probably literally what the body was needing in that moment is so confusing, I'm sure, for the client in that situation, because they're like, well, I'm trying to maybe listen to what my body is trying
Yeah.
to tell me, but I'm also having this inner battle of, oh, is this, addictive behavior? Am I addicted now to just sugar instead of now the substance? Oh, that's so confusing. And it is such a hot topic in diet culture that, oh,
Yes.
food is addicting, and so you should treat it the way you would treat drugs and alcohol. But what I find is that, well, you can't, because food is a necessity. You can't be abstinent from food. And so kind of going off of that, it sounds like you've kind of dealt with probably talking to both of those things of dealing with the eating disorder, or dealing with, the binging that a lot of
Yeah.
people think is coming from food addiction, and also dealing with drug addiction. So how does that, what do you take of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly like you said, Marissa, it's really important to distinguish that food and sugar are necessities. We need them to survive. And I think it's important. I mean, how I understand and classify eating disorders is that it isn't even really about the food. It's about the feeling of being in control of your food and body weight and
Mhm.
shape. What we get addicted to is the idea that we can change our body. We get addicted to the idea that if we lose this amount of weight, our life will change. People will see us differently. We will, be happy, whatever, all the things that diet culture and thinness promise. And they do overlap in that sense of, even for some people, right? Like drinking can be in the same space of, it can promise, right? Like that you'll be popular. It can promise that you'll be liked. It can promise that you'll be funny, that you'll have friends. So I do often talk about like the root of alcohol culture and diet culture is very similar. And I do this talk where I compare, there's like a Kim Kardashian, right? Like Kim Kardashian ad where you can compare, she looks almost the same and the messaging is the same, of like Nutrisystem versus like Bacardi or some other like alcohol, I forget, that she's like advertising, and
Oh,
the
wow.
message is the same. You'll be popular, you'll be like me, you'll be happy, you'll be rich, you'll have friends, whatever. So yeah, to me it's like, even with substances, obviously substances are different because they're actually addictive. They create a thirst and a want for themselves. And it's really hard, I think, because people can feel addicted to sugar or food, and that scares them because it feels the same sometimes initially as drugs or alcohol. But the difference is, if I or you or anyone was given all of like the alcohol and drugs potentially they wanted, your tolerance would keep going up and you would keep wanting more. Where if you were given access to enough food, it starts, if you let yourself eat as much food of different types of food and things like that as you want, it starts to become a lot less interesting and you don't want it anymore. Where that's not true for substances because they're actually addictive. And I talk about that a lot with, like, even if you think about alcohol specifically, people sometimes push back on me, well, being like, well, we've been drinking alcohol for, like hundreds of years. It's normal. If I try to cut back, I want it more. Or I get frustrated when sometimes intuitive eating dietitians talk about like intuitive drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And like, we're not meant to consume alcohol. Yes, we can, but it's actually, I've done research on this because I'm writing a book about this. And the real reason that we're able to consume alcohol is because there was a genetic mutation that happened like thousands of years ago, or millions of years ago, I guess, where we were able to eat rotten fruit. And that's how we were able to metabolize alcohol. I mean, that's how the first alcohol existed, was
Wow.
from rotting fruit. And it wasn't as nutritious as regular fruit, but we were able to eat it. And then eventually people used beer a lot of times because it was a way to drink water that was contaminated and you wouldn't die from it because it was fermented. So that whole tangent is just to say that alcohol and food, or drugs and food, aren't the same, and they need to be, while their underpinnings can be very similar and they can overlap, the recovery needs to look different.
Totally. And I definitely want to go into that, how it looks different. But what you were saying about just kind of how you could eat and eat and eat all the food that you want, and eventually you're not going to want more. But with alcohol, it's totally different. I get that question a lot, especially through social media, who don't
Yeah.
from people who don't totally understand my message, being like, no, you just have to restrict further. And I'm like, the restricting further of food causes us to want it more. Whereas actually giving ourselves that unconditional permission causes us to want it less. And so you really can't treat food food disorders, binge
Yeah.
eating, anything like that, the same way you would treat an addiction to drugs. Because and I've seen some of the research that people throw at me, and it's like, oh well, you get that dopamine from food. I'm like, yes, you're supposed to. Like,
You
we're
also get dopamine from hugging someone.
exactly, right?
Like,
That doesn't mean it's addictive,
right, right.
right? It's like we're supposed to get these feel good, hormones and neurotransmitters, everything from food, because it is something that not only gives our body what it needs, but does bring joy in certain ways, but that it doesn't automatically create an addictive pathway. And often, because I specifically work with people with binge eating, they feel it's addictive, but when, like you said, you get down to where it came from, it's coming from the fact that it's so off limits that when you allow yourself to have it, it's like you can't stop. But I give kind of the same analogy where it's like, let's pretend you ate pizza for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day this week. How many days before you're over it? Whereas, like you said, the same sentiment could not be applied
Yeah.
to drugs. You just keep wanting it more. So let's kind of dive into
Yeah.
that. What are kind of the biggest differences between treating an eating disorder? And if you don't mind, like kind of specifically
Yeah.
talking to binge eating,
Yeah.
that and the difference between the way you would treat an addiction or just kind of a use of alcohol or drugs.
Yeah. So I think like remembering specifically with binge eating disorder, right? Like what people get addicted to, or what is the crux of the binge eating disorder, is that um they want to change their body. They want to be thinner most of the time. They want to not eat a certain way. And if you think about how long potentially someone has been told, right, like not to eat this, not to eat that, it, like, I think of recovery as we have to do the opposite of what we were doing in, our addiction or our disorder, whatever. So to me, right, obviously we know that with substances, it's doing the opposite of not drinking. But with binging, it's not about the food. It's about not trying to lose weight or not trying to restrict. The restriction, I mean, I think it's hard when people don't understand the science of, and you can, this as a nutritionist, right? Like the science of how restriction causes binging. And if you don't know that, I think it can be really hard to navigate that.
And I kind of want
Yeah,
to asterisk that as well, of just the restriction, yes, but kind of what you were just saying, also just the
yes,
intent of
the
restricting,
intention to
or the
restrict.
desire to restrict. I mean, I've talked to so many people who they're like, I haven't been binging for a while. And then someone said something about my body, and I immediately thought, well, maybe I could lose some weight just that thought caused them to binge and they hadn't even acted on it. So just
Yeah,
the thought alone can be strong enough to cause our body to want to keep us safe by making sure we're eating
exactly.
enough, causing a binge from there. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And like, I mean, the difference obviously with alcohol and substances too is like we don't have a famine response to alcohol and substance use or substances because that's not in there, where your body is constantly trying to respond to keep you safe, to keep you alive. So if you, even like you said, if you have a thought or you have a desire, or you start thinking about trying to lose weight, or you think about restricting, that is going to trigger your body's famine response and want you, it's going to make food more desirable. And I think also recognizing a lot of people grow up with food scarcity in some capacity, whether it's like actually they grew up in a way where they couldn't afford food and they didn't have access to enough food, or their family, like, and parents limited their food. I mean, I grew up
Mhm.
in a household where, you know, candy and dessert wasn't allowed or was hidden and restricted. And like that messaging, a lot of us, it starts really, really young. Like if you think about kids being obsessed with sugar, it's a lot of times because of just it's so desirable and it's so off limits. I feel like I went off on a tangent of what we were saying, but
No, I mean, I think it's so important to point that out because I see
yeah,
that so often. And when I'm talking about, okay, well, where did this start or where did this come
right,
from? They're like, well, my diet started when I was 16. When I was like, well, let's go deeper than that. Why did
right,
the diet start? And it's like, oh, because, I was now allowed to go out on my own with my friends, with my car and get fast food. And then I started binging on fast food because in their household growing up,
yeah,
fast food or certain types of food were demonized. I'm like,
yeah.
that's, where we have to start to work on the mindset around the fast food, not necessarily the fast food being the problem. So yes, that can get into a whole
Yeah.
other topic about the food insecurity or the
Yes.
scarcity mindset growing up for sure.
But I think you would ask me, right, like about just recovery and treatment and stuff like
Hmm.
that. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that obviously, like we've been talking about how like getting into, I'm a huge fan of intuitive eating, all foods fit. A lot of times to get into recovery from binge eating disorder, it does look like letting yourself eat different types of foods, trying different foods, fear foods, things like that. Like, the habituation of trying different foods so that they lose interest. Um, where when it comes to substances, obviously it's not engaging in substances. I'm also a fan of harm reduction, depending on what that person is going through and things like that. But I also find what's really important with both is a lot of times we use both to deal with our emotions. So I find a lot of people, whether it's substances, whether it's, an eating disorder or both, we use something outside of ourselves to deal with our emotions because we never learn how to regulate our emotions. We never learn how to identify how we're feeling. If you think about how a lot of us were raised, and I mean, it's helpful to put into context that like therapy only really became a real thing in like the 1950s, so that isn't that long. So if you think about our parents' generation, their generation, they were just
Hmm.
doing what they thought was
And
best. But
and how long it took for it to not be stigmatized to
yes,
where anybody could go.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, right? Like in the 1920s, in the early 1900s, asylums existed. And if you were crazy, you were just locked
Wow.
up. So, yeah, we've come a long way from there, but it makes sense that parents weren't really taught how to sit with your child when they're upset. So, a lot of us, I find, didn't know how to deal with our emotions, were scared of our emotions in some way, or didn't learn coping skills, how to regulate how we're feeling. And instead, we used, whether it was a substance, whether it was a diet, we used that to regulate. So a lot of it is kind of, I talk a lot about like reparenting and looking at what like was missed growing up and learning how to meet your needs, self-care, um, boundaries are a huge, huge thing that I talk about. Yeah. So it's like
Yeah.
looking for all of that stuff.
When you were explaining that, I saw like a Venn diagram where like
Yeah.
the two opposite sides, the differences were the permission,
Yeah.
when it comes to substances versus food, we have to work on differences and the allowance of those items,
Yeah.
but the overlap is the emotions, the maybe mindset around those foods, the coping strategies, the
Yeah.
boundaries, like those definitely overlap when it comes to managing binge eating or any other type of food control
Yeah.
issues you might have, and also the substances. So I think that's kind of great. You should make a graphic on that for your Instagram.
I do have one. It was like so
That's great.
overlapped. I did it a long time ago. I'll have to show you it. It's so overlapped. It's not a Venn diagram because the overlap is almost more than the like two
Yeah.
sides, because they also come with like physical like issues, right? Like
Hmm.
all of these other things. Yeah, I don't have it in front of
Yeah.
me, but yeah, there's so much overlap. And I think especially like you were kind of alluding to too, so often, I mean, like I said, if you think about 45% is that, 15 to 45%, people will develop one or the other at this, at some point. I think so many people end up with both in some capacity. And and then even like the risk factors of relapse are really important to think about both, because, if you, like I was saying, if you start realizing that you were using substances because you had gained weight, that becomes a risk for relapse of substances. If you realize, well, I don't like that I'm gaining weight and I am not good at dieting or whatever, all I have to do is start using substances again and I will lose weight. And there's a really heartbreaking quote, like common like quote that is often heard in rehabs, that's, I would rather be skinny and high than fat and sober. And it's like the most
Oh my
heartbreaking
gosh.
common thing that people say. And I think it just shows how deep diet culture is.
Yeah, yeah, that is. And there's that quote just reminds me so much about how when I'm talking with clients about that desire to lose weight, I always talk about, okay, there are two options here. We can pursue that desire or we cannot. Let's talk about the cost and the benefit to
Yeah.
both of those. And I think that some people are ready to say, okay, the cost of pursuing weight loss is not worth it. And the benefit of healing that desire and working on those belief systems is worth it. Some people aren't ready for that. Some people aren't
Yeah.
ready to face how hard it is really to kind of go against the status quo and make peace with your
Yeah.
body and reject dieting. And so I think that quote just reminds me of that, of sometimes when I talk about those two options and the cost benefit, you can see people are like, oh yeah, no doubt about it. I would much rather be miserable, but lose weight.
Yeah.
And that is something that takes, I think, a lot of time to work through where that comes from, what maybe the belief is around not pursuing that, like what fears are there.
Yeah.
And that's why therapy is so important.
Yeah.
Because although always tell people I definitely teeter on the line of like being your counselor and your dietitian because
Yeah.
so much of it is emotional. But
Yeah.
then when I see somebody is really not willing to give up that
Yeah.
desire to lose weight because it causes them to distress to think
Yeah.
about it, then I'm like, okay, maybe we should talk about having a supplement of therapy with this as
Yeah.
well. So one thing I want to get into outside of, substance use disorders is just general social casual drinking
Yeah.
or smoking, marijuana, all of that,
Yeah.
because it's come up in my coaching before. And it's always such an interesting conversation about when we're healing from binge eating, sometimes the drink or the weed, whatever, allows them to binge, so they start to contribute the alcohol or the weed to being what's causing the binging. So do you ever kind of see this, but where it's not necessarily like a substance use disorder?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really common thing, because a lot of times alcohol or marijuana or whatever, like it lowers, right, your inhibitions. So it kind of just puts you in a state of doing what, there's a phrase in the addiction community of, whenever you drink or use something, it that isn't your substance of choice, you end up just wanting that like drug of choice. So if you're someone who is struggling with binge eating or bulimia or something like that, it's really, really common when someone drinks or smokes that they end up engaging in that, because when you drink, especially, like the rational part of your brain shuts down. You can't make good decisions because you can't predict, can't think into the future very well. So I think it is a big challenge, and something that someone might want to explore, not because they have a substance use disorder necessarily, but especially in early recovery from an eating disorder. I think it can be really helpful to not engage in drinking or smoking or something like that, just so that you can build up some more time in the
Yeah,
beginning when you're
absolutely.
like, when it's harder, the longer time you have in recovery, the stronger that muscle is going to be a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I always explain it as it's less about the substance, it's more about the need to binge was already there,
Yeah.
but the substance allowed you to kind of let your guard down a little bit to say, "Oh, screw it. Like whatever, I'm just going to allow
Right.
myself to engage in this." And so there that correlation happens where, "Oh, I think that the smoking is causing me to binge, but really it's just showing you what was already there." But I find that once we heal what was underneath the need to binge
Yeah.
for a while, and like you said, build up that muscle, that when they decide to smoke again or drink
Yeah.
again, it doesn't automatically cause a binge.
Totally. And I think it's how much also you're able to, right? Like you might eat more or foods that aren't like, that don't make you feel great, right? Like after
Mhm.
when you get high or you get drunk. So it's also, I think, the skill of being able to not restrict the next day. I think
Mhm.
that is such an important part of it too, because if you're still struggling with fear foods, or something like that, and then you wake up the next morning and you're hungover and you've eaten a bunch of food that like that was scary to you, you're going to really want to restrict. You're going to be like, you're going to
Mhm.
beat yourself up, and you're going to go right back into that place of like the restriction and then the binging. So you really have to also, I think, develop the muscle of being able to eat different foods and being able to eat more than maybe you feel like you should or want to or is
Absolutely.
normal for you or whatever, so that you don't the next day really, really want to restrict. And instead you can like go get french fries or whatever you're craving the next day, because you probably will be, and just like know that it'll even out, and eventually, probably the next day you'll want something, a little bit with more nutrients because you're more recovered. That's just kind of how it works.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's so important to remember that it's not even just about the moment, it's about the moment surrounding the moment where you allowed yourself to eat some late night pizza with your friends.
Yes.
Because simply the guilt or shame associated with a moment can cause you to binge again. Like we were kind of talking about earlier, it's not necessarily about the behaviors. Because I hear so much from people. They're like, I'm not restricting though. So why
Yeah.
am I binging? And then we start to talk, and I was like, well, you have the should talking, oh, I shouldn't have eaten that much, or
Mhm.
there's a lot of guilt and shame associated with
Yep.
that food, and those are restrictive mindsets even if you're
Yeah.
allowing yourself to eat all foods. So when you have a night out with your friends and you get late night pizza, it's uh, allowing yourself to have that, enjoy it, and move on without it being something that feels it has to be made up for, or something that you feel guilty about in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that that is something that, it takes time to figure out. I think,
Totally.
especially with bulimia, it's a little trickier with the night of being like drunk or high, because if you like drink too much or something like that and then you feel sick, it's going to be very tempting to want to purge. So I think when it comes to restriction and binging, it's more even about the next day, where I think bulimia is sometimes more that night, because it's so
Hmm.
easy to just purge after you've eaten that pizza and you're not in the front, like a rational frame of mind to try to like not or something like that.
Right, right. And so if you found that there was a strong correlation between engaging in those behaviors and when you're drinking or something, you would try to recommend maybe abstaining from
Yeah, I think
alcohol
taking a
or
break for like 30 days or something like that. I mean, I think like questioning your relationship with alcohol is like a healthy thing to kind of do anyway.
Mhm.
So yeah, you don't have to forever. You don't need to make a declaration. I'm really against the idea that people have to call themselves an alcoholic to look at their drinking. But yeah, I think just like taking a break for 30 days, and seeing how that goes as a way to help your recovery can be really, really helpful. Because
Yeah,
I'm a really big
yeah.
believer too in like doing one thing at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. Which
So
I'm sure can get kind of messy when we're trying to work on our relationship with food and our relationship with
yes,
drugs or alcohol. So it's so individualized. And that
yeah.
reminded me of, did you watch the Demi Lovato documentary on
I
YouTube?
haven't yet. I need to watch it.
It's interesting because the way, spoiler alert, I mean it's not really a
Yeah.
spoiler alert, but spoiler alert for anyone listening who wants to watch it. In the end, she talks about how everyone telling her, "Oh, you have to be abstinent. You have to be abstinent. You're an alcoholic. You're, a drug abuser. Like you're all these things," actually caused her to want to do those things more because she felt
Mhm.
she had to, I don't know, live up to what everyone else was saying. And so when you were like, you don't necessarily have to call yourself an alcoholic, because like sometimes doing that can cause people to maybe get in their head about it
Yeah.
or feel certain ways. Just the way she was describing it, I was like, oh, she had to find a way for this to work for her
Yeah.
rather than her team all trying to throw all these words, this language, this
Yes.
treatment onto her. And now she's trying to find her own balance. So
Yeah.
and I think that the way she described it really resonated with myself, and many of my clients have told me,
Yeah.
just realizing, oh, it's about me and what I find works for me, not necessarily what someone is telling me I have to do. A lot of it's just that experimentation, and it has to land with you as
Yes.
the client.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it is unfortunate that up until recently there haven't been different pathways and different ways for people to explore it, because I do believe everyone's different. People have different ways of things that work. We all have different priorities and different lives, and for some of us, like you were saying, like the cost isn't worth it. For some of us it is. So, and it might change in your life too. So I think giving people the freedom to experiment, to try different things, to see what works for them, um, is really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this was such a great conversation. I think it was just nice to hear the different angles, the different ways eating disorders and substance use overlap, and just kind of getting your expertise on this all. And it sounds like you're writing a book, which is super exciting. That's
I am.
awesome. So, when is your book coming out?
It will be out on January 4th.
Ooh, so exciting.
Yeah,
Well, is it going to be, can you give us, what is it about?
I can. It's called Not Drinking Tonight. And it's a book that's going to help you kind of examine and look at your relationship with alcohol. And it's really, I also talk about eating disorders and the overlap of them in it a lot. Um, and it's kind of just like giving people, I kind of say that in the introduction that it's kind of like an informed consent of alcohol, of like all the things that you kind of wish you knew about it. Um, that not everyone gets to know. And then once you read the book, it's filled with kind of exercises and different things to help you examine if you want to take a break from drinking. And it's non-judgmental and I'm very like, you don't have to call yourself an alcoholic. But let's look at, some of the things that alcohol makes life harder with.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited to see that. And I'm
Yeah.
sure it's still a work in progress if it's not coming
Yes.
out until January. So
Yes.
good luck. Good luck with finishing that. That's
Thank
awesome.
you. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to kind of close this out, some words of wisdom to those that are listening who are likely struggling with binge eating or their relationship with
Yeah.
food, and how alcohol or substances may tie into this. What would you say to them?
I would say, especially if they're struggling with both, do one thing at a time. Often in the recovery community, we talk about you have to do the thing that's like going to kill you first, or what's the most serious first. So if your eating disorder is more unmanageable or creating more pain for you, start with that and don't worry yet about substances and things like that. I think a big thing is everyone tries to do everything at once. So small goals is my recommendation regardless of where you are on it. It's so easy to get overwhelmed when we think about letting yourself eat pizza forever, right? Or letting yourself eat sugar forever. And if you can focus on just today or one meal, it's a lot easier to work through.
Yes, I love that. Like, give yourself time, give yourself
Yeah.
grace to
Yeah.
explore and
And
take a
you'll
deep
probably mess
breath.
up on this. Like,
Yes.
it's not going to be perfect. It's like a journey. It's going to be some steps forward and some steps back, and know that going in, because I think that we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to just, get from point A to point B, or loved ones can put pressure on us to, why aren't you making progress fast enough? And, I think the deepest recoveries are those where we can explore different things and try and fail and figure out what works for us.
Exactly. Yeah. Resisting, quote unquote, making mistakes doesn't actually make us not make mistakes. It honestly just
Yeah,
keeps us from, moving through that to learn something from it. So
totally.
allowing yourself to ebb and flow through the recovery.
Totally.
Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I loved this conversation. So where can everyone listening find you?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram or TikTok at Therapy for Women. And you can also check out my practice at therapyforwomencenter.com. So we're based in Philly, but we serve a lot of states across the country too.
Awesome. Yay. Well, everyone go check her out and we'll chat later.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening through this podcast episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know that I did. Amanda was amazing to have on the podcast, and I really hope you enjoyed listening to her insights and our conversation around this really nuanced but important topic, and the way that substance use plays into your eating disorder recovery or relationship with food. So if you enjoyed it, make sure you let me know either by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or letting me know over on my Instagram at behind.the.binge. So it's behind the binge on Instagram with periods in between the words. And I would love to hear your thoughts over there. So again, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.